Hey, what's going on guys? Caleb Wisted here, and today I'm going to show you everything you need to know about braided fishing line. Now I just got back from the store, brand new purchase, new reel, new rod, and I've got to spool this up with some new braid. Now I was able to go to the line aisle and pick out this exact braid, walking past hundreds of other spools of line to find exactly the one I needed. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be able to do the same thing. Now, what am I going to cover in this video? Number one, I'm going to cover when to use braid. When is it best to spool your reel with a main line of braid versus mono or fluorocarbon? Number two, I'm going to go over which braid to choose for each application so you understand how to pick out the right braid with the right line size, the right color, the right style, the right brand, all that stuff for what you need to do. Number three, I'm going to actually spool this combo up with the braid and show you my entire process on how to put your braid onto the reel properly. Number four, I'm going to go over all the knots that you need to know when working with braid, including backer to the spool, braid to the backer, and then braid to your leader. And at the very end of this video, I'm going to give you 3 tips that everyone using braid should definitely know. So stick around till the end. Now let's get started with number one, when to use braid. Okay guys, really quick before I get into number one, when to use braid, I'm going to go over a basic overview of what braid is. So braided line is basically Dyneema or Spectra fibers woven together into a very, very tiny rope is the best way I can explain it. And the properties of braid are, number one, it's very low stretch. So when you cast that out, you get almost no stretch in between your bait and your rod. And that means to you, basically, you can feel a lot better. And number two, you can set that hook and you know that hook's going to move instantly with the braid without any stretch in between. So that's property number one. Property number two, it's very strong for its diameter. So you can have a much thinner diameter line with a comparable pound test to fluorocarbon or monofilament and get much less resistance in the air when casting and much less resistance in the water when retrieving. So that's property number two. Property number three is it has basically no memory. So unlike monofilament or fluorocarbon, when it comes off the spool, there's no coils in the line. It comes off perfectly straight. You reel it back on the spool and it comes off straight again over and over and over. So that's basically the traits of braid that you need to know for now. Now let's get into when to use that braid. All right guys, when do we use a braided line? Well, for me the answer is almost all the time. I've been using a braid to fluorocarbon leader setup for almost all of my fishing for years, and it's worked so well for me, except a couple of applications. So instead of going over when I actually use braid, I'm actually going to cover when I don't use braid. There's really only 2 scenarios for me where I don't use a braid to fluorocarbon leader setup. Number one is in freezing conditions. If it's super cold out, your braid will soak up water and it's going to freeze on the spool and give you trouble. Number two situation is when I need stretch in my line. And there's certain situations where I'm fishing for like bass with crankbaits or big steelhead with small hooks. I want a lot of stretch and rubber bandiness in my line so that those fish don't rip the hooks out with big head shakes. And those are about the only 2 applications where I don't use a braid to fluorocarbon leader. All right guys, so now that you understand when to use braid and you decided you want to use it, which braid to buy. The difference between all braids out there, I don't care which brand makes them, there's really only 2 types. There's 4 carrier and 8 carrier. And 4 carrier means there's 4 ropes woven together, 8 carrier means there's 8. And the big difference is basically in the smoothness of the line. 8 carrier braid is very smooth, it's got a more rounded edge to it, and it's a much slicker line and it's a little bit less abrasion resistant. 4 carrier is much rougher and it's got a much more ropey feel to it, but it's a little bit more abrasion resistant than 8 carrier. That's kind of your only 2 types of line. Now as far as brand, I'm not sponsored or anything like that by any line companies, and I've tried a whole bunch of different lines throughout the years, and I can tell you I've watched dozens of break strength tests. I've watched tons of abrasion resistant tests. People have tested this stuff over and over, and Power Pro still either keeps up with or outperforms almost every single braid in both the 4 carrier and 8 carrier categories, and that's what I'm using most of the time. Power Pro's 4 carrier is just the original Power Pro, and their 8 carrier is a Super Slick V2. And I'm going to get into when to use each one of these in a minute, but I just kind of wanted to narrow it down for you and basically let you know what I use right off the bat. So when do we want to use 4 carrier versus 8 carrier braid? I use 4 carrier braid in any conditions where I know there's going to be a lot of chance for abrasion, around rocks, around brush, and anywhere where I might be fishing around docks or pilings, that kind of thing. It's more abrasion resistant. And then also around vegetation, heavy vegetation. It'll saw through lily pads, leaves, you know, any kind of weeds. It tends to cut through them because of the more rough edges on it. When I'm going to use 8 carrier braid, virtually all other conditions, because it casts better, it's smoother, and it's just an amazing line. However, I don't want to be using it in conditions where I could end up fraying it and cutting it off super easily. So that's kind of the difference between the two types of braid. Now, one other braid that I use a lot is Suffix 832. It's an 8 carrier braid, and it's a very solid line that I've used for many years, as well as the Power Pro. If that's more your style, feel free to use that too. It's a great line. I've just kind of switched over to the Power Pro back again because I trust it and I've used it for years. So those are my 2 primary braids, and you can certainly experiment, but I just wanted to let you know that's what I use. Now let's get into line size, basically our pound test. It's the same measurement they use for monofilament or fluorocarbon, and it's going to determine how much weight that line can hold. Now I will tell you this, through all the different demonstrations and tests I've watched online, every braid is a little bit different. Some braids tend to overcompensate for their pound test. Other braids get it right on. A lot of the Japanese braids, 10-pound test is 10-pound test. You get 10 pounds 1 ounce, that stuff's going to break. Power Pro, in my opinion, is overrated. So you're going to get more pound test out of this line than it actually says on the spool. So that's a good thing to know. They're not all exactly the same. So you kind of have to experiment with each one and see if it holds up to its standards. But basically, I like to have a little bit overrated braid and treat it like it is an actual 10-pound test. Now, when using braided line, there's one thing that I've found. If you go too light, it can break on the hook set because there's no shock absorption. So I personally like to go a little bit heavier on my braid selection than I would if I was choosing monofilament. So in a 10-pound or 8-pound monofilament situation, I'm going to go with like a 12 or 15-pound braid. And the crazy thing is, like for instance, this 8 carrier braid, this is 10-pound test, but it's a 2-pound monofilament diameter. So it's the same diameter as 2-pound mono. I can fit a ton of this line on my spool and oversize it no problem. And maybe I'll lose a little casting distance over using a lighter braid, but I'm not going to compromise the hook set on a bigger fish. Now when I'm fishing bass in really heavy cover, I'm going to use probably a 30-pound 4 carrier braid, maybe even a 40 to hoist them out of there. And in really, really heavy cover like frogging or musky fishing, I'll go as heavy as 80 or 100-pound braid. And that stuff is almost impossible to break. When I'm fishing panfish, I'll go down to a 6 or 8-pound 8 carrier braid. I can cast a 32nd ounce jig a mile with that stuff and still have enough strength to hoist a 2-pound crappie no problem. So that's kind of the range of, you know, sizes that can give you a little bit, hopefully, of a target for what you're fishing. And hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of what to get for a pound test when it comes to braid. All right, let's talk about color. Braid comes in a bunch of different colors. The 2 probably most popular are going to be your moss green and your bright chartreuse yellow, high vis. The dark green is meant to be more invisible, obviously, but I'm always using a fluorocarbon leader, so I'm not too worried about that in most situations, other than when I'm like fishing super dense cover, flipping, or casting frogs and lily pads where I tie a braid right to my lure. Most scenarios I'm going to use a high vis line because this stuff is so thin that if you're using moss green and the light is low and you're looking down at the water, you can't see your line at all. And I like to be able to see my line if I'm like drop shot fishing or you know, fishing Senkos or something like that, I want to see that line move when that fish grabs the bait. So most of the time I'm fishing like a brighter color like this high vis, but in stealthier situations where I'm tying braid direct to my lure, I'll definitely go with the moss green. There's other colors out there, there's red, there's blue. Kind of experiment and see which one works for you, but I've been spooling, I'd say 80% of my rods with the high vis stuff lately. All right guys, so hopefully that gives you all the knowledge you need to go pick the right braid for what you're gonna be doing. And now let's get into spooling up this rod. So we'll go through the process, and the braid I chose for this particular situation is Power Pro 15-pound test version 2 Super 8 slick in moss green. The reason I picked this line is basically I'm going to use this for an all-purpose walleye rod, so I can rig with it, I can drop shot with it, I can jig with it, and I wanted a beefy enough line that I can use some bigger swim baits or bigger jigs and be able to like get my sinker hooked up on the bottom and still be able to get it out really well when I'm rigging. So I went with a little bit heavier line, 15-pound test. That's a little on the heavier side for walleyes, but it's going to give me a little bit more power when it comes to some of those bigger lures and getting snagged up. So the reason I went with moss green is I fish super clear lakes, and when I'm rigging or drop shotting, sometimes I don't want to tie a super long floral leader on there. I just want to go straight to my rigging sinker with the braid, and that gives me a little bit more stealth for that kind of fishing. So in this particular case, I went with the moss green. All right guys, so here's the basics for what you're going to need. You're going to need a good pair of scissors, you're going to need the braid, and you're going to need some kind of monofilament for a backer. And the reason you need this monofilament for a backer, or basically to go directly to the reel, is on these reels there really isn't much for that braid to stick to, and it being such a slick line, if you just tie the braid directly to this spool, close the bail, fill it up, that entire spool of braid can actually start spinning on the spool, and then it's completely useless. You can't use it at that point, and you have to tear it all off and start over. So I like to put monofilament onto the reel first because it grips the spool much tighter and it's not going to slip on you. Now the second reason that I like to put mono backer on here is I don't use as much braid. Braid is so thin that you can get a good amount of braid, plenty of braid for fishing with, onto your spool and still have a ton of spool left over. So you don't want to necessarily spend so much money filling up your entire spool with braid if you don't have to, because it's much more expensive than mono. So I'm going to fill up the spool far enough that I know I can just get 150 yards of braid on this spool, and that's going to be more than enough that I need for fishing. And then I don't need to waste, you know, buying a 300-yard spool and getting it partially empty and having to throw half of it away. So I'll show you how to do all that here, but just so you know, that's what the backer is for. So how the heck do you know how much backer to put on to get your braid exactly right? Well, every spool has designations on it for how much line is going to fit on that spool. This particular one, I can see 12-pound nylon line or monofilament. It can fit 220 yards. And I can also see on this one in particular that 0.18 millimeter braid, it will fit 300 yards. Now I have 150 yards here of 0.19 millimeter braid. So I know if I put all this braid on this spool, it's basically only going to fill it halfway. So I can either eyeball halfway with the backer, or I can read this and I can put 12-pound mono on here, and I know it's going to fit 220 yards of the mono, and I can put roughly 110 yards of mono on here, and I know that's going to basically cover the backer that I need, so that when I put that 150 yards of braid on, it fills all the way out to the edge of the spool. The reason you want it to come all the way to the edge of the spool is it's going to cast much better and much further if that braid is only about 1/16 of an inch from the lip of that spool. So we want it as far out as we can get it, and we don't want to run short. So basically what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to eyeball. There's actually like some lines on the inside of the spool here. I can see about where halfway is, and I'm just going to eyeball halfway with the backer, and I'm going to tie that on here and fill it up about halfway, and then I know my braid should be pretty much dead on. All right, so I'm going to use 12-pound Suffix, just regular monofilament for this. And one thing you always want to remember to do is to put it through the first guide of your rod. It's much more difficult to spool this up if you don't have it through at least that first guide. So I'm going to spool it up, get this spool going through my first guide here, just like so. And now I'm going to tie just a double overhand knot in my monofilament. So I'll show you how to tie this knot a little bit later. Like I said, I'm going to show you how to tie all these in depth, but basically it's just overhand knot and another overhand knot, and we're going to tighten those down on the spool nice and tight. Make sure you open that bail before you do this, or you're going to have to cut it out and do it again. I'm going to cut that tag really short, and now I'm ready to wind that monofilament down here. Now I'll show you what I've got rigged up for basically a spool holder slash tensioner that I designed here. It's right behind me. So basically how this works is I've got a little rubber gasket and a washer and a thumb screw, and then I've got this same setup here, but it's on a spring. So all I have to do is pop that spool on there. Every spool comes with a hole in the middle. And now all I gotta do is screw this thumb screw on, put a little tension on it, tighten that baby down, and now my spool has a nice tension on it for filling up the line. So I'm going to go ahead and spool this mono up about halfway now. All right, as you can see now, I've got about half of the spool filled with that monofilament, and now I'm just going to cut the line and tie on my braid. All right guys, so I've got my spool out here. I'm going to pull off a little bit of line of that braid, and I'm going to take my monofilament in my other hand, and I'm going to tie a uni to uni knot. And it doesn't have to be a super strong knot. It's not going to be a factor when you're fighting a fish, because hopefully it's buried back enough in the spool that you never have to deal with fighting a fish and hitting that knot. So I'm going to tighten up the mono side, and I'll show you how to tie this knot more in depth at the end of this video, but you may already know how to tie this knot, and I don't want to bore you with the steps. Basically that's our knot. It's a uni to uni. I'm going to tighten that up, trim the tags, and then we'll keep reeling. So one of the nice things about this tensioner, guys, is I don't have to hold my finger on here to keep tension on this line as it fills up the spool, because what happens if you don't keep tension on it, this will pile on here really loosely, and you'll end up sinking this line in when you catch a fish or hook up on a snag, and it'll dig into that spool. So you want it nice and tight on here, and that's one of the things that this does for me. Now, this little tensioner I built myself, which you can certainly do, but there's some good other tension devices out there, and I'll leave links for a couple in the description. But let's keep filling this up. We're almost done here. All right guys, I can see I'm about a 1/16 of an inch from the edge of the top of this spool, and I don't want to overfill this spool because I know wind knots are much easier to get when you're overfilling your spool. Now I can also see the spool here showing up through the braid, so I know I'm almost to the end, but I still don't want to overfill it, so I'm going to snip it here. And I know I don't have a ton of waste because, as I said, there's only maybe 10 or 15 yards left of line on that spool, so I pretty much nailed it. I did a little bit more mono than I needed to get this whole spool on here, but not by much. So that measuring technique worked out pretty dang well. Now, one other thing you can do if you don't have a line filling tensioning device is you can just grab like a rag or some kind of paper towel and kind of grip that line with it. That way you aren't going to burn your fingers as you're reeling through and keeping tension on that line to fill up your spool. All right guys, now all I have to do is thread through the rest of my guides here, and we are back in business. So now I've got a rod all set up with braid, and this is going to cast awesome. It's going to be perfect for what I need it for, and all I really need to do now is add a leader to the end of this line to do whatever I want it to do. So it could be a 15-pound leader for a heavier swim bait, or it could be a 6-pound leader for fishing a drop shot rig. But the nice thing about braid is you can oversize it a little bit and still be able to downsize for a finesse presentation if you want to use it on that particular rod. So now let's get into the 3 types of knots that you are going to need for this braid. So the first one was that backer to the spool, which I'll show you, and then that uni to uni knot from the braid to the backer, and then I'll show you the knot, which is my favorite knot that I use to go from the braid to the leader. Alright guys, I figured it'd be easier to tie down here at the bench, get a little better lighting. So we're going to start with the first knot that I'm tying, which is just the double overhand knot to the spool, and then we'll get into the 2 line to line knots that I tie from the backing to the braid and then the braid to the leader. Here's how we do the double overhand knot. It's very simple. Make sure your bail is open. Take the main line in your left hand and the tag end in your right hand. Cross them over once and tuck the tag under. That's just your single overhand knot. Tighten that down. Then we're going to do the opposite way. Take that tag end that's now in your left hand, cross it under. And I always like to stick my 2 middle fingers in right here and give this a nice tug to tighten the first knot down before I cinch down knot number 2. Give that a good tug, and that's gonna cinch it right up on that spool. Now of course we want to trim this tag end, and I like to trim it really nice and tight to the knot as I can, just so we don't have a big bump sticking out from that tag end. And then you can close your bail and you're ready to start winding on that backer. Alright guys, that was pretty simple. Just a double overhand knot. Almost everybody already knows that knot. But now let's get into the 2 line to line knots that I'm going to use when using braid. Number 1 is the double uni knot. And the double uni knot is a great knot to use for tying your backer to your braid. It's pretty strong, so if you happen to get into your backing on a big fish, it would probably hold up. The only reason I don't use it for line to leader is because it's bulky and it goes through the guides and kind of ticks through the guides and snags and catches a little bit more than the FG knot, which is the 3rd knot that I typically use for my main braid to leader line knot. You can use a double uni knot for that knot, and it's a good knot. However, it's not quite as streamlined or quite as strong as the FG. So right now I'll show you how to tie the double uni for that backer to braid, and then we'll get into the last knot, which is my favorite, and that is the FG knot. Alright, so the double uni knot basically starts with a tag end of each line in each hand, and you're going to parallel them like so. And to start tying the knot, I'm basically going to grip the tag end and the main line end of both lines in my left hand, and I'm going to grip just the tag end of whatever line is facing my right in this hand. And I'm going to double them over with the tag end on my side to make a loop like this. So now basically I have the tag and my other 2 lines pinched in my thumb. And now we're just going to pull this tag end through the loop a number of times. Now the number of times we go through this loop basically depends on what the size of the line is we're tying. But for most braid, like walleye size braid or light bass, I'm going to go through this loop about 4 or maybe 5 times. Okay, so now I've looped it through that braid 5 times, and I'm going to cinch up by pulling on both lines with the left hand and just the tag with the right hand. And you can see that knot cinched down quite nicely on my monofilament. Now that knot will move, so I can actually slide that one up and down the mono if I have to. Now the secret to this knot is it's basically 2 stoppers that are going to run into each other. So now we're going to swap ends. We're going to flip the braid to this side, because now we can tie it the exact same way with the mono. I'm just going to double that over again, just like I did on the other side, and I'm going to make my twists. And I'll usually go about 1 less on the mono because it's usually a little thicker, so I'm going to go 4 turns on the mono here on this end. We're going to do the same thing, pull both lines with the left hand, just the tag of the mono, and of course I want to wet that, cinch it down, and now we've got basically 2 parallel knots, one here and one here, and we're going to slide them together. So we're just going to pull that line until they bump into each other, and that is one heck of a strong knot. And again, this will work for your leader as well. And now all we have to do is trim these 2 tags. And there you have it. There's the double uni, and as you can see, it does have a little bulk to it. You know, that going through your guides is going to make a little bit of a bumpity bump going through the guides, but it is a very strong line-to-line knot. All right, guys, so there you go. There's the double uni knot. It's a good knot. You can use it either way you want to on braid, either end of the braid, and it'll work. Now let's get into the FG knot. This is my favorite knot to tie when I'm tying my braid to my main leader, and I've used this one for years. It's an amazing knot, has incredible strength, incredibly streamlined knot that goes through your guides so easily you won't even notice that it's there. So let's get into it. It's a little bit more in-depth knot, takes a little more work to tie up, but I think you'll definitely see what I mean when you see the final product. First thing you have to do with an FG knot is get some sort of anchor point downstream of the braid you're going to be tying, because you have to be able to hold this tight in your mouth and have it somewhat taut while you tie the knot. So usually I'll just prop my rod underneath something or up against something so it can't come back at me, and so I can put a little tension on that braid. Alright, first thing I'm going to do is put the braid in my teeth. I'm going to pull that line somewhat taut but not super tight. The next step is to lay the fluorocarbon over the top of the braid, and I go from left to right, and I leave about a 6 to 8 inch tag off the end. I'm going to loop that fluorocarbon over the top of the braid and back around the back side away from me. Then I'm going to cross over and come under the braid towards me, and then back away from me again, and I'm going to continue that process for 21 loops on anything over about 15-pound test, and then I'm going to do about 25 loops for anything under 15-pound test. Okay, now I've got my wraps on there. I'm going to hold my mono or my fluoro tight here, and I'm going to do one whole, just one overhand knot right there. Okay, and that's going to hold the FG knot in place. And I'm going to kind of cinch that down, wet the knot, and here's where you really want to give it a good tug. So I'm going to wrap it, give it a nice, cinch it up good. That's what's going to really cinch those knots down on each other and kind of do that Chinese finger trap effect. Okay, so now all I have to do is finish the knot, and I can leave my line loose now. I don't have to have it tight anymore. I know my knot's not going anywhere. And to finish this knot, I'm just going to do 2 more overhand knots over both of the braid and the fluoro. So 1, 2, now that is a finished knot other than trimming. I do one more step that some people don't do after this. So I'm going to trim my fluoro really tight to the knot. As long as you've cinched it up well, you should be able to cinch or trim it pretty tight. Now what I do is I'm going to add 2 more overhand knots on the braid above the fluoro. And the reason I do that, 2 things. Number 1, it seems to cinch down better on the braid than the braid and the fluoro together. Number 2, it kind of creates a ramp down from that blunt end of the fluoro so that I don't have that blunt end kind of butting up against my guides. So, and then I can trim the braid pretty close here too, about an 1/8 inch, just to leave a little room for air. And now we have a knot that's basically as streamlined as you can possibly get for any kind of fishing knot. I mean, it's almost not there, and it's super strong, and it goes through the guides beautifully. So that is how I tie up an FG knot, you guys. All right, there you have it, guys. There's your 3 knots. Those are the only 3 you really need to make it work. All right, guys, it's time for 3 tips that everyone using braid should definitely know. The first one is to flip your braid. This is going to save you a lot of money on braid, and it works really well to get the most out of your braid. So if you've got a reel that's worn out on one end of the braid, on the end you've been using, you can reel that onto another reel, and then onto another reel, and then back onto the original reel, and it will flip the braid around so that now the good end that was on the back of the spool is on the front, and you can get twice as much use out of your line that way. One other thing you can do is if you have, say, 2 reels that have the same pound test on them, one of those spools of line is ready to get tossed, the other one is ready to get flipped. you can strip the line off the one and then just reel the bad end onto the inside of the spool of the other one and just go reel to reel, and then you've got fresh braid on that new reel as well. So that works too, either way, but that's a great way to save some money on your braid. All right guys, tip number 2 is to clean the end of your braid before you tie a knot. There's a waxy coating on almost all braid, and if you don't remove that, a knot can slip. Either an FG knot line to line or a line to lure knot can actually slip out just because that line is so slick. So all you really have to do is, for instance, I can just take my sleeve here, run it through a pinched sleeve or a pinched rag, and that's going to help remove that waxy coating off that line, so you're not going to have slippage on your knots. All right guys, tip number 3 is one I hope you never have to use, but man, if you do, it sure comes in handy, and that is to remove a hook using braided fishing line. If you've got a hook stuck somewhere in your hand or wherever it happens to be, you can use a short piece of braided line to remove that hook. And I've done this several times on myself as well as on other people, and it works great. So basically, if you got a hook stuck in your hand, you wrap a piece of the braid around the bend of the hook, just double it over, wrap it through, and get a good grip on it. And then as you apply pressure downward, that's going to open up a channel for that barb. And then you just yank on that braid, and that hook's just going to slide right out the way it came in, and you're going to have a painless hook removal. Works really well, so definitely keep that in your bag of tricks as tip number 3. Hopefully that video was super informative for you guys, and if it was, make sure you like, subscribe to the channel. Got a lot more in-depth videos like this, and I'm going to leave one more right here. We'll catch you later guys. Get hooked up.